Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we can probably get started now, although there will be a few more people chiming in, I'm sure, as we get underway. But I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming to our Assessment SIG webinar this afternoon. We're very thankful to IELTS for sponsoring the session, and we're very thankful to David Bowd for making himself available to us to present on really what is quite a hot topic, is where do we start in designing assessment in the age of generative AI? Now, many of you will be aware of the work that David Bowd does in higher ed, assessment in higher ed. And David Bowd, he's a Deakin Distinguished Professor and he's Foundation Director of the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. So that's CRADL. And I know that many of you are aware of the great work that CRADL does. He's also Emeritus Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. And David's one of the most highly, or is the most highly cited scholar in the field of assessment in higher education. So although his area of speciality is higher ed and assessment, it is very relevant to our area of work in EAP and in particular in the preparation of students for further studies. And I've been very greatly influenced by David's work. I've read a lot of his work, and in particular around sustainable assessment, and that's influenced a lot of the design that I've done with my team here at Macquarie. And David's work is certainly something with the Assessment SIG. We're working at putting together a reference library for our SIG members to find articles that are related to a range of assessment themes that are relevant to EAP, and we'll certainly be directing you towards some of David's work as well within there. So I'm going to pass across to David in just a moment. David will present, and he will respond to questions at the end. Just please do put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. It's important that they go into the Q&A box. They'll be missed if they're in the chat. So I'm going to hand across to David, and we look forward to hearing from you at the end in the Q&A. Thank you, David.
Well, thanks very much for that nice introduction, Cara. Well, what we're here to do today is to address one of these big issues that we've got in the whole of education at the moment, not just higher education, and that is we've been challenged by a new technology, and that new technology is generative AI. And we will recognize it through things like ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini. There's about a dozen different Gen AI tools out there. I'm not an expert in your area. My field is higher education primarily, and assessment for learning in that area. I'm also not an expert on Gen AI. What I am focused on is the implications of Gen AI in the whole assessment space. So what I want to do today is to give you a bit of the big picture about assessment and Gen AI and how they might interact in real courses. And the thing that I want to focus on is not just a whole lot of how to do it things, but to give you some of the conceptual tools for thinking about the important questions to ask ourselves. And that's important because we're in a state of change. ChatGPT came on the scene a couple of years ago, and we're still coming to grips with that. We're now seeing a plethora of other approaches. And what we need to do is to equip ourselves to understand all the things that are going to pop up and what do we hang on to in our understanding of assessment, and what things in that area do we need to modify in some way. And as Cara mentioned, we'd be looking to do questions and answers in the Q&A function. And one of the advantages of the Q&A function is rather than hearing the person who makes as much noise and puts their hand up the highest, what you can do is you can uptick a question that you like. And that means more people that like a particular question, the greater the chances of that being answered within the time we've got available. So that's by way of introduction. Now let's see where we're going. It's just another slide to start with. This is an overview of the kind of 4 points I want to cover. First point is AI is here and it's not going to go away. However much we might wish it, it is a normal part of our everyday interactions, at every single level, personal, professional, you name it. This is a change in the environment in which we live as human beings. So a few comments on that to start with. Then I want to shift to assessment and to ask the question, what does assessment always need to do? To look at the absolute core, the fundamentals of what we need assessment to do and how it needs to do that. Then want to move on what kind of principles that we need to follow when we've got this interaction between assessment and AI, and leave you with some of the challenges for assessment design now. And I know a lot of you are grappling with them, as we speak. So these are not challenges that have got an easy fix. These are challenges that we all need to grapple with, and we need to grapple with them for the next few years at least. So AI is not going away, permeating the whole of society. And it challenges us in education, in every level of education, to two things. It's a challenge to our pedagogy, because students need to learn how to use these new tools. And it's also a challenge to assessment, because they can use those tools for good or for bad. And the bad is using the tools to avoid learning and to avoid being discovered that they haven't learned. And we need to focus on both of those. But today I'm going to focus more on the assessment end than the pedagogy end. What we're discovering is that Gen AI, and I'm using Gen AI as the collective term for all these different chatbots, it's a useful aid to learning even in its present forms. Also, though, as we're also discovering, it provides a great temptation for those students who want to avoid learning and to disguise that fact. So, what is Gen AI? It's based upon a large language model, and it produces what we might call seductive text that appears to answer any question posed to it in well-expressed language. The thing that everyone's impressed by is the clarity of its language. What it says is something else, but the language in which it's expressed is quite coherent. At present, it has some limitations and biases. Some of these limitations and biases will be overcome in the short term, and by short term, I mean in the next few years. And other limitations are fundamental to it being a large language model. And we need to kind of keep that in mind. So, for example, it does things like hallucinate. People use the term hallucinate to mean it gives you completely false information that just isn't true. And it does it completely confidently and boldly. It also gives you completely false references. These are completely invented references. These are references that sound like they should exist, but don't exist. Also, what we've got at the moment, and this issue is going to get much, much worse in the years to come, we've got different versions which are freely available. So we've got the free version and we've got the version you pay for. And at the moment, there's an issue of access. Like, everyone can access the free version, but the better version, where you get a better result, isn't free. And it's very likely that the business models of all these big companies will mean that the cost of access to the better models is going to go up and up and up. So it's already a marker there for great potential for inequity. Great benefit is students can use it at any time, day and night, whenever they want, for getting comments on their work. They can use it to generate ideas and text for any task. So some of that is good. Pedagogically, it can be very good, but also there's a downside in students can use it to so-called augment their own work. That is, pass AI's work off as its own. And one of the tricky things at the moment, and will continue, is that if a student uses it in a final assessment, we can't know whether the students have met the appropriate learning outcome. It challenges what we call assessment validity. We don't know whether they met it or not. And it's particularly tricky because each output from the chatbot is unique and detection is problematic. Now, you probably heard that Turnitin produced a kind of how you detect AI text very early on, and it was laughed out of court. A lot of universities picked it up very quickly and then dropped it just as quickly because the number of false positives was huge. At the moment, there is no way of detecting Gen AI text. If it's extremely awful, you can probably pick it up. But for the main, this is something which is beyond anyone. Sorry, my. So we need to make some assumptions then. So what are the key things we need to focus on? We need to create conditions in which students learn and don't avoid learning by subcontracting what they do to Gen AI. We must also assure that students who complete our course meet the learning outcomes to the required standard. Now, this is mandated by TEXA in the higher education standards, and our institutions can be deregistered. These are higher education institutions can be deregistered if we don't do this. At the moment, it's not checking up on these things very carefully, but I'm sure it will in the future. And the third thing we must assume is that we can't pretend that chatbots are not available. Every one of our students will be able to access some kind of chatbot that will enable them to do some of the things or a lot of the things that Gen AI can do. And they are always accessible except when we totally control the environment and block their use. If we lock them up in a room without computers and get them to do tasks, we might be able to control their access to them. But under any other circumstances, it's just too demanding for us to control what the students do. So we must make the assumption when they're not under these highly controlled conditions that they will be using Gen AI as much as they wish. Okay, that's a bit of a warm up on Gen AI itself. So let's just kind of shift slightly sideways onto assessment and to ask ourselves, what is it that assessment is for? And there's a number of different ways of cutting the cake. The way I like to cut the cake is in this way. I argue that there are three key fundamental purposes of assessment. An assessment needs to do each one of those in different ways and at different times. The one that we're all very, very familiar with, although we might not use the language of assurance, is this first one. Assessment is there to assure that learning outcomes have been met. Students enroll in a course, that course has outcomes, and assessment exists in order for us to say, this student's been enrolled in this course and they have achieved these outcomes, and we've got some evidence of that. In old language, you used to call that summative assessment, but that term isn't precise enough. It's about assessment for assurance. The second purpose for assessment, again, the very familiar term that we've used for it in the past, is formative assessment. But essentially what formative assessment is about is enabling students to use information to aid their learning now. So formative assessment is used on the pathway towards assessment for assurance. And it helps them work out where they're going, how they're doing, giving them useful tips and information about the best way to get there. And the third purpose of assessment is to build students' capacity to judge their own learning. Cara mentioned sustainable assessment, and this is where sustainable assessment fits in. It's not good enough that we can judge a student's ability to do something unless they can have the same ability to know what they know and know what they can do and know what they can't do, then they can't function in the world, either as a learner or as a practitioner of some kind. So I'm going to focus mainly on the assurance one, but I'll have a little on the side on the other two. So the importance of learning outcomes. I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here, but learning outcomes are statements about what is needed to complete a course. They represent academic standards in terms of what students should be able to do. And a good learning outcome enables us to be very clear about what that is. And we also specify learning outcomes at the individual course unit level, something the individual teacher might have responsibility for, and at the program level, over the program as a whole. And they have serious consequences. If we state them, we must assure them. If we're stating them and not assuring them, then we are misleading our students. So we must take our own learning outcomes seriously. And just to see, there's a big big brother in the background looking over our shoulder on this. And this is from the Higher Education Standards Framework. It's been revised since then, but this bit hasn't been revised. The expected learning outcomes for each course of study are specified consistent with the level and field of education of the quality of the qualifications awarded and informed by national and international comparators. Yes, we all know that. That's quite acceptable. The clinch comes when it says methods of assessment are consistent with the learning outcomes being assessed and are capable of confirming that all specified learning outcomes are achieved at some kind of threshold level, and that grades have already reflect the level of student attainment. So there is a legislative framework for our focus on a standards-based view of assessment. So what is the demand of assessment? It demands we can judge whether students demonstrate attainment of a learning outcome to a given standard. And poor achievement, and this is one of the things which I have most difficulty with some of my more traditional university colleagues. Poor achievement on one outcome cannot be compensated for by good achievement on another, which means we can't average marks over different outcomes. So the idea that there's an exam and the students get a percentage mark per exam is nonsense in the world of learning outcomes. We can only do that within a set of learning outcomes itself. The averaging over different outcomes isn't meaningful. It also implies that we must have transparent standards. And of course, we probably all know now that setting a pass mark is not setting a standard. We might use rubrics to help indicate what the standard is for any particular task, but a pass mark is again too crude a measure to determine whether students have met the required standard. And of course, when we average things, then we just compound one level of ignorance with a greater level of ignorance. And finally, all assessment must be standards-based. Norm reference now, and by that I mean judging students against one another, is taboo. This is not something which is legitimate to do in any form of higher education. So let's have a think about the implications for the context of Gen AI. So if assessment must ensure that students have met specified learning outcomes, what might we do? Now, there is no generic answer to this. There's no one size fits all. But I want to give you 3 illustrations of things that people have done which help this problem within the present context. So the first strategy that people use is what we might call the sequenced or nested set of tasks. And that is, rather than having completely discrete tasks through the semester, what we do is that we link them together so that each subtask is building students' capacity to do a more substantial task at the end. And by doing this, students can build their confidence progressively. They can see where they're going. They can see they've achieved something. They're actually achieving something towards the end that they want. We can also spot if there are discontinuities between the products they produce at different stages, can provide an indication to us there's some problem there. So we don't expect students to become incredibly more fluent from task 2 to task 3. And if they have become remarkably more fluent, then this is a warning signal. And implied in this, and implied in a lot of Gen AI work, is that we need to know our students. And I know it's not so much an issue in the areas that you work in, but in some areas we need to rethink the role of having anonymity for all final tasks. We need to ask ourselves, when is anonymity really needed and when is it not? Because there's a real downside of anonymity. And the downside of anonymity in the Gen AI context is that we can't notice what's going on. Now, anonymity is a good thing. Don't get me wrong here. It is a way of ensuring that students aren't discriminated against because of features which are relevant to the task at hand. So we do need to do it in some contexts, but in others, not so much. The second one you might think is blindingly obvious. Well, it is blindingly obvious, but it doesn't mean to say we can't take it seriously. We should avoid setting tasks that are answerable by Gen AI. And the simplest way to do that is put it in ChatGPT or whatever one you've got available and see what you get out. If you get out exactly what you'd expect a good student to say, it's no good. So we need to think about tasks that Gen AI is not good at dealing with. And it's good at dealing with all standard problems, all standard essays, all the things that we often used in the past as a way of kind of assessing our students. So we need to think about making students accountable for their responses by always being prepared to justify and articulate their answers. So they need to know that it's not good enough to produce the work. They might be quizzed on that work, and we might want them to elaborate on what they mean by that. There's a way of checking to see whether they really get it or not. And at the moment, we can set highly contextualized, personalized, and recent tasks which require close attention to contemporary information. If we set a task on something that was in the paper this morning, and we set it in such a way that it involves some characteristic of the student themselves, then this is much more difficult to be responded to by Gen AI and other things. So, for example, maybe there was a train strike or a threatened train strike. Maybe the question we ask the student is about the implications of their travel to their college under these circumstances. That's the kind of thing where, at the moment, Gen AI has problems with. But of course, and we need to say this about everything today, as it improves, it may become harder and harder for us to set tasks which it can't answer, or it doesn't answer very well. And the third strategy, and this is exercising a lot of people now on quite a wide front in higher education all over the world, is to shift away from assessment being the responsibility of each module, each unit we teach, towards assessment for assurance being a program level assessment. And what we have is that we have fewer assessments for assurance, but we guard those very well. We guard the integrity of them very well. That's one strategy. Second strategy is we have a lot more activities, a lot more data points, as the programmatic people say, most of which are low stakes. So lots and lots of low stakes can add up to a final assessment, which is something that we have more confidence about. Another strategy here is we use curriculum mapping to involve all those who contribute to a program. So what you do in your unit is a function of what needs to be done for the program as a whole. And this means that things which are idiosyncratic to things that we might uniquely do ourselves, but don't fall directly under the program learning outcomes, then we don't need to worry about those for assurance, which means we don't need to protect them in the same way. And the mapping involves identifying where each program learning outcome is introduced, developed, and assured. So we know where things are going on, and we know which aspects of assessment to protect and which aspects we can be more relaxed about. And finally, to use more integrative summative assessments. So we might put a whole lot of things together that are done in different units in one assessment, which covers more than one of them. So just to pause here, some key takeaways. We invest our energy into assessment integrity for assurance only. We will never, can I stress, never be able to ensure integrity for every active assessment that we might have done in the past. This is just not achievable. We also need to think very carefully about ensuring that what students end up being able to do and the circumstances in which they do it is formally recorded, not just by a grade, but by a level of achievement with regard to a learning outcome, with regard to a particular context. And of course, a general point is that we shouldn't penalise students for early failures to meet standards by having grade point averages. For assurance, though, we may need these additional checks. So, for example, we may need random oral confirmation. So we may not introduce oral assessment generally. That's just too big. We can't handle that. But that we might say that in this course, that you might have your work orally assessed at random. And you really do need to do it at random. It's completely unfair on the students if you use it in a deliberate strategy. And the important thing about random checks is that they're triggered without a prima facie case of misbehaviour being established. This is not about checking up on students that we are suspicious of. This is a part of a normal process to deter students getting into trouble in the first place. There's a kind of a fear going on at the moment about cheating, and it is important. But the thing that I and my colleagues are wanting to stress is that validity is more important than cheating. And some of the strategies that we use by unseen invigilated exams, which can only assess a limited number of learning outcomes, are worse. The cure is worse than the disease. So we need to be very careful that we're not dealing with cheating by making our assessment less valid. So going back to our three purposes, the second one is the formative one, enabling students to use information the way they're learning now. And feedback is a central part of this. Feedback is important because it's one of the few ways courses are tailored to individuals. Most of the things we do are to do with the whole group, but this is important because it's for individuals, and individuals are the learners. So we need feedback, carefully designed feedback processes, and there's a whole lot of a very useful website called feedbackforlearning.org, which you see there, which can give you some ideas. The comments we give to students is a small part of the feedback process. It might be an important part in certain circumstances, but without active engagement from the students in eliciting comments from us, in processing comments from us and from others, and on acting on comments, we can't say that feedback has occurred. We can't say, well, I gave students useful comments on their work and I'm absolved from my responsibility for feedback. Feedback must always be judged in terms of its effect on learning. Doesn't matter what nice things we said to the students, if it didn't end up in them doing something better next time around, it ain't feedback from my point of view. And we should remember that students get inputs from very many sources, from ourselves, from peers, from the community, from the LMS, and from Gen AI. And don't forget, they will be using Gen AI to get feedback on their work, quite legitimately. or even if you don't think it's legitimate, you can't affect it anyway. So a few takeaways for the assessment for learning purpose. It helps students know that assessment for learning is essential to meet the assurance standards. Although this is not the final assurance stage, if they're not doing well here, then they're not going to meet the standard at the end of the course. And we can use evidence from previous cohorts from their own course about students that don't engage in feedback, for example, not actually doing very well. And we've got to create this belief in students that if they cheat on assessment for learning, they only sabotage themselves. And for some students, that's a hard message to sell, but sell it we must to be a good teacher. Let's always talk in terms of meeting standards, never grades. We've got to focus students on the things they can do something about. And students must use, with our help, to actively use feedback processes to benefit themselves. So we need to train them in feedback literacy, which a whole lot of people are writing a lot about at the moment. And students must know when and when it is not legitimate to use various chatbots to aid their learning. It is legitimate for all of us to use these devices, but there are some circumstances in which it is not. This distinction is vital. And for every one of our students to know that is vital. Back to the three purposes again, and the final one here, which is building students' capacity to judge their own learning. If they can't judge the quality of their own work, how do they know what to learn? If graduates can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they practice effectively? And if they can't help each other judge the quality of their work, how can they ever work effectively with each other? That's the rationale. And we often talk about it in terms of developing students' evaluative judgment. Evaluative judgment's the capacity to make informed decisions about the quality of their work by themselves and the work of others. And these are the two key components of evaluative judgment. Students need to understand what quality is. If they don't know what quality looks like, if they haven't been exposed to it, if they haven't engaged with it, how on earth can we expect them to produce quality work themselves? And the second part of evaluative judgment is to be able to compare their own work with these standards of quality and of finding out what the gaps are and what they need to do about it. And these are just some of the strategies, and I'm not going to discuss these because we don't have time, that we can use to develop their evaluative judgment. So key takeaways in that third box: we need to focus students on the question of what does good look like at every opportunity that we can. We need to provide multiple opportunities for students to judge their own work and that of others as part of all courses. So, for example, are we asking students to self-assess their work before they give it to us? This is a very important part of developing their evaluative judgment. Do we ask all our students to be able to comment on the work of others? Is that a normal part of our courses? I don't mean to grade, I don't mean to mark, but to provide feedback to others on the quality of their work. And we also need to build students' evaluative judgment to use AI tools effectively. To use AI tools effectively, they need to develop prompting and judging skills, because you get the best output by asking AI better and better questions. And we also get better results from AI by looking at the answers we get and asking ourselves, is this really what I want? Is it addressing what my need is? And we can help students learn how to use chatbots and calibrating their own judgments. It's another paper. So, summarizing all this stuff about the different purposes of assessment, we need assessment for assurance, and it needs to occur after a period of learning is complete. If we have assessment for assurance and we record what a student can do, when in the very few months later, they can do something a lot better, then this is not good assurance. Assessment for assurance. Assessment for assurance is about what the student can do after they've completed something, not midway. So assessment for assurance generally needs to occur late in whatever the process is. Assessment to enable learning needs to occur early in whatever the process of learning is. It's needed during the process of learning. At the end, it's far too late. Giving students detailed comments on their final exam is a complete waste of time. We should be actually using the time we spend on that to deploy it much more effectively, much more early on, where we can have a much greater influence on learning. And that third category of building their capacity to make effective judgments is needed right the way through, from the beginning to the end. So finally, on assessment design, what do we need to know about assessment design? This slide is just a little plug for this website here, assessmentdecisions.org. And this is something we developed out of an OLT grant some years ago about how we design assessments in higher education. And it provides all sorts of resources about assessment design in the same way the other website gave a whole lot of resources on assessment for learning. So we know a lot about assessment design generally, and I'm not going to go over that again. What do we particularly need to know in the Gen AI context? One, and I'm banging on about this point, but I think it's important. Regressing to traditional exams can handicap students and undermine standards. So what happened in the first few months after Gen AI, ChatGPT came out, there was this move in all the universities saying, oh, we've got to kind of go back to traditional exams. But there was a price to be paid for that. And most universities weren't willing to pay that price. And that price is we limit the learning of students and we produce inferior graduates. Now, some universities have realized that these traditional exams have actually not been very functional even before Gen AI came along. So the Deakin pre and post-COVID, we now have 85% less exams, 85% less exams than we did pre-COVID. And that's equipping us very well. So these exams will equip students for subsequent practice. We need some major design of assessment to avoid unrealistic tasks, or ones that can be outsourced, as we talked about before. They're needed to have multiple occasions to assess each program level learning outcome. Program level. Have fewer, more complex tasks which relate to threshold standards. Threshold standards are the minimum students need to be able to achieve to complete the course. And have more specific, unique, current, and contextualized tasks. This final one is the thing that we can put most energy into right now, and it will pay off. We also need an assessment design to securely protect a few key tasks. We can't protect them all. We need more assessment for learning and less, but much higher quality, risk-managed assessments for assurance. So what we're seeing more generally is people saying, well, we don't just need less assessment. That's a naive way of thinking about it. We need less assessment for assurance, but much, much better assessment for assurance, and at least as much, if not more, assessment for learning. And don't forget, we need to assure the program, not each single element of it. And final slide, what's happening more widely? Well, there's plenty of institutional guidelines on how to cope with AI and assessment now. They're coming out of our ears. I mean, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of them that you can search on the web for. Be very, very cautious. I mean, clearly you need to take account of those from your own institution. But many of them are often simplistic, they're out of date, or they only apply to some versions of Gen AI. So the territory is moving rapidly. More Gen AI apps are coming to market. and better versions involve payment. And just reading today in the conversation that one of the things that's going to happen with the business models of Gen AI providers is that they're going to rack up the cost of using the better versions, because at the moment they nowhere near cover their cost of running them. So if they're going to get a return on their investment, they will necessarily need to increase cost. There will always be free ones available, I think, but the free ones might not necessarily be terribly wonderful. We're starting to see more principles-based approaches, which I think is good. And they don't tell you how to do it, but they provide principles that need to be met. An example is this image on the right here. This is a report from Texa, and this is a principle-based advice to the sector about assessment reform in the age of AI. They produced a more recent report, was at the end of last year, which gave examples of what each institution was doing. I don't recommend that, because some of the things they're doing it's very useful to prompt ideas, but some of them you wouldn't want to follow yourself. And the final thing I want to say is research is starting to be published on the effects of different strategies for coping with Gen AI, and the same strategy on different students in the same class. And one very disturbing finding, which we've only got the initial hints of this, but I've got an awful suspicion it's going to come up bigger in the future. The same strategy that we use may have very, very positive effects on the stronger students in our class and a very negative effect on weaker students. So it isn't a matter of us having one nice, nifty strategy. We need to think about how different students within the same cohort are going to respond differently to it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to take some questions and have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. There's a lot of good principles in there for us to think about. I think in English language, it's particularly tricky for us because we are quite specifically assessing students' language use. So anytime we give those students an assessment task or something that can be done outside of a controlled or invigilated environment, we're looking at language that has been enhanced by tools. So that point two that you spoke about, avoid tasks that are answerable by Gen AI, I think is particularly relevant to us, and that's the space we need to put our thinking into. So I've got a couple of questions. Please do pop some questions into the QA area, not to the chat, if you have some questions. One of them, which is sort of related.
Can I just, before you carry on, can I say there's not much upticking going on?
So no, there's not much activity in there.
Can you I'd like to encourage everyone to go into Q&A and select the questions you want answered and give them a tick, and then put some other questions in as well. Sorry to interrupt, Cara.
Not at all, not at all. So I think the first question that we can look at is, and it's getting upticked, is generative AI going to kill off the research essay as an assessment tool?
It won't kill it off. We will need to modify it. Now, some of the things about Gen AI at the moment that it's not very good at is it's terrible at referencing. It will invent references. So when we have research essays which involve students being able to cite proper sources, we can be quite confident we can use that for the time being. If we're also happy for students to use Gen AI tools to help structure their thinking, but as a part of an intermediate step in producing work, then that will probably be okay. For example, at the moment, if people use Grammarly before they submit a paper, then nobody's too worried about that. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the research essay actually trying to do, and which bits of it are safe and which bits are vulnerable at the moment. So I think that's an interesting one, that at the moment we have the ability to retain the research essay as long as we think about what might be done with it.
Thanks, David. And then you mentioned that, for any body of work that people produce, they should be prepared to be able to justify it or explain it, and that this can be, that it's fairer actually if this is done in a random way. So I guess that sort of taps into two areas of questions that we've got in here. One of them was around what sort of how that randomization sort of works. We've been asked if you can unpack the random questioning approach again, because I had some questions around that too. It seemed to me that perhaps a student who was asked randomly to justify or further extend on a written report may be disadvantaged against another student who wasn't, if that was in some way impacting their final grade.
Yeah, we need to think about what we're doing the oral for. It is not another assessment. It's the same assessment. All we're doing is that we are checking the integrity of the original response. So students should get no more grades for what they say in the oral, and no less grades if they are inarticulate, but they clearly can show that the work they produced was their own. So the answer is that they shouldn't contribute to students' grades, although in some circumstances we may discover that the student is so far off what they've produced in writing that they need to either do it again or some other issue like that.
Mm-hmm. And do you have examples of strategies that you found have disadvantaged weaker students while potentially advantaging stronger students?
Almost all use of Gen AI disadvantages weaker students, because weaker students, one of their characteristics is that they don't know how little they know. And by using Gen AI, they can form the impression that they know more than they do. So there's an intrinsic problem with weaker students. And one of the things that we need to probably put a lot more attention in pedagogically is helping students to ask the really hard questions of themselves. Do I really know what this means? Can I really believe what this says? So I think we actually do need to put some energy into critical questioning the outputs of Gen AI. And I think we will need to devote time in the future, or now even, to activities in which students are realizing that they need to be much more critical and skeptical about what comes out. So, for example, there's a whole class of strategies that people are using at the moment in which you give students an assignment, and instead of students doing the assignment, they give the assignment to Gen AI, right? And they get a response from Gen AI, and because it's Gen AI, each student gets a different response. That's the way it works. And the task the students have is to critique the response of Gen AI and actually say what's wrong with it and what makes them think there's a problem with some aspects of that response. So there's a whole category of strategies people are using now to help students be more questioning strategically of these devices.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to raise the level of student skepticism. The good students are already skeptical. We don't need to worry about them, but the weaker students are incredibly vulnerable to this.
Mm. Yes, yeah, they are. When it comes from the machine, it's taken as much better than anything that they could ever have produced themselves, which is not at all the case.
And they get discouraged. They say, I mean, if this is what I'm supposed to produce, I'm never going to be able to produce this. It's the most off-putting thing that they can experience for some of them.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a question here, just about, in this sort of EAP, in this language and pathway space where, as you know, we're preparing students for further studies in higher ed. And if the assessments are sort of keep changing, really, I guess as academics grapple with the challenges that are thrown up, what advice do you have for us in this space to stay on top of how of how these changes can feed back into our courses? What should we be doing?
Well, I think we need to be we need to have our pulse on changes, and we do need to, in a sense, be upskilling ourselves of finding out about the different strategies people are using and how the environment is changing. Um, I don't think we've ever been at a point in history before when the things that we teach and how we teach is changing so rapidly
Mm.
because of technology. There's been no technology in the past that has had as much direct influence on pedagogy and assessment as the one we're experiencing right now. And the only way we can cope is by finding out what people are doing, questioning what they're doing. Does this make sense? Looking at principles, working out whether I'm following these principles well, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of seminars available. There's lots of web chats that are going on. There are people posting things on YouTube about strategies they use. So there's a whole bunch of things. And I mean, for example, one of the things that your organization can do might be to facilitate access to examples of these things within your own area.
Hmm. Okay. Thank you. And I'm just wondering, have you or your team done much work in how useful Gen AI is in providing feedback for students in their assessment planning and writing?
Yes, we have, and we're involved in a number of studies at the moment. Um, one very amusing one, which is just in the process that this could be coming out shortly, is we did a study of Gen AI with doctoral students and their supervisors. So we took the example of the feedback that a doctoral student got from his supervisors, which was fully recorded in text and in video. So we had a full documentation of this, which occurred before Gen AI was released. The student then, as a graduate, asked exactly the same questions of Gen AI, and we compared the difference between the feedback given by Gen AI and supervisors.
Mhm.
And the really amusing outcome was that Gen AI answered the student's question. The supervisors said the question they asked of them was not a good question and that they should be asking a different question.
Mm.
Um, the thing about Gen AI is that it will always behave in the way that you want it to behave. And this is the problem. You project your own concerns, your own framework, your own ways of seeing the problem onto it. And they will try to discern this and give you back something that you like. So it's a person pleasing mechanism, and we need to keep that in mind. Um, so I think that's a thing that we need to take into account is that the kind of things you get from feedback from Gen AI can be very useful. So they're very useful at very practical, immediate things. But they're hopeless at saying, well, you're completely off course. You've gone down the wrong pathway here. You should be doing something completely different.
Mhm.
Um, so that's one of the things that we need to kind of hang on to. And,
We've got
and our conclusion for this is we need both. We need Gen AI because any student at any time, day or night, can ask a question. Right? They can't do that of their teacher. Just impossible. So there's a payoff from that. But on the other hand, if that's all they do, they get into a loop, a self-justifying loop, which they can't escape from.
mm, Thank you. Yeah, we've got actually we have an English Australia Action research project this year, which quite specifically looks at the use of Gen AI tools for helping students to enhance their sentence structure or their paragraph structure or things like that, like using it as a feedback mechanism. So it'll be interesting to see the outcomes of that. So we've got a couple of questions. I mean, and I don't know how you feel about answering them, but you can't throw them at you anyway because they're getting some upticks. So one is how can we as Aliquot educators measure students' language ability. We have learning outcomes that require us to verify that students have sufficient command of language to enter university. So how can we do this if we do not know if Gen AI wrote an assessment or the student wrote the assessment?
Well, I mean, the answer is very simple. If we want to be absolutely sure, we put students in conditions in which they can't possibly ask Gen AI to do the assignment.
Yep.
And the point I was making earlier was that we can't do that for everything, right? We can't do that for all the things we want. So we've got to do some really hard thinking now about what are the things we protect and what are the things we do need these controlled conditions for and what we can be relaxed about. And this is the really hard thing, you know, because we cannot protect all the things that we thought we could protect in the past. Now, of course, it's untrue that we could protect them all, but we lived under that fantasy for many years.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. Another question I have here is, can you provide an example of an assessment that will measure students' language ability, allowing for the use of AI?
I'm not entirely sure what the question is getting at here.
Yeah, I think they're wanting you to answer the impossible. I guess they're wanting to have an assessment design. My answer to that is what you've said before. You've got to have controlled tasks, and understand that when you have an assignment task, and you can't control whether the students are using Gen AI, you can't be grading the language in the way that we have traditionally graded the language. It's not necessarily the student's language. You need to grade other things.
But we need to balance that with giving students lots of practice, which we can't control. And we need to create the culture within our courses that students actually take those things seriously and don't, in a sense, use Gen AI. So we might set them a task and we say, well, we really want you to do this task without Gen AI. We're not going to penalise you for this. You're not going to get lower grades for this. But it's absolutely essential, both for you and for my understanding of your language ability right now, that you do this without any help. And we do need to engage in these more persuasive pedagogical discussions with our students that convince them that they're not there to cheat us, right? I mean, many of your many of the students you have are going to be judged on external tests, IELTS or whatever, in terms of their language ability. So the issue isn't them cheating you, right? If they're in the business of using Gen AI when you've advised them not to, for a formative task that doesn't involve any grades, then they need to be completely convinced that they are completely fooling themselves. This is a very, very counterproductive thing to do. And we need to spend time and interaction with them, convincing them that they are shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah. I think that's a really key learning point, that Gen AI, for not for avoiding learning, but for supporting learning. I think it's a really good message to drive home for students. Well, look,
It will do both, but under different circumstances. And we need to be really clear-headed about when we're using it to promote learning and when it can be used to inhibit learning.
Okay. All right. Well, we are out of time, but thank you so much, David, for speaking to us today. I think your session has been very, very useful, and I think we've had some great questions in there. I didn't get to all of the questions. One was quite long. It was a difficult one to unpack in a QA discussion. So apologies to you, Chris, I think it was. But thank you. Thank you again to IELTS, and we'll say goodbye for this afternoon.
Right, good. Thank you very much for your participation. Cheerio.
Okay, bye-bye.